Good evening, Dave.
What's up, James? How are you?
All right. How you doing?
Awesome. Doing great. It's been moving out of my apartment, so basically all day today has just been moving stuff out and setting up my room. So
A little busy, huh?
a little busy. Yeah, I haven't been able to do as much as I'd like today with the business stuff, but that's okay.
Hey, man, I really appreciated part one of this, so I'm looking forward to part two.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah. What's up, Trevor? How are you?
You're from Steve today?
What's up, Steve? How are you?
Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Doing good.
How's your weekend?
Not bad. Just a bunch of work. That's all it was. And then today was a big moving out of my apartment. So that's what's been my main thing today.
Done?
Huh?
All done?
Almost. I got to make one more run to pick up the last stuff, but I mean 80-90% of it was done today, so that's good.
Hopefully you had some help.
Nope. Nope.
I moved quite a few times in my life, and every single time I've moved with only one other person, and it was grueling. It's like
Yeah, I mean, moving the stuff inside wasn't bad. It was just undoing it all and then organizing it all, and that's what
Sure, yeah.
took, hours upon hours.
Well, do yourself the favor of actually making sure you unpack your boxes as like a goal on a weekly basis or daily basis. And if you don't, just get rid of it. I
Yeah.
learned that I was moving boxes from previous residences that I never unpacked. I was just like moving packed boxes after a few years. I'm like, I'm just dumping these because
Yeah, I threw a
clearly I
bunch
never
of
used
stuff
it.
out today. Yeah, I threw a bunch of stuff out. Steve, we'll wait, we'll go to, let's do 6:35 and then we'll get started. 3 minutes and
Sure.
we'll jump at it. Patricia,
Yeah,
how are
last week
you?
was tough. Get base. Yeah.
Oh, you cut out, Pops.
I was saying last week it was tough. You had compete against Pace's live Zoom same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Patricia, how are you? What else do we have in here? That's it.
For those that are here, think I recognize a couple of names. Who was in the first session last week? Just need to shout out or put in the chat. You and your dad were. I think Trevor was
I
here
was.
too. Yeah. James, Patricia, I'm not sure if I remember your names from last time.
No, I was not on live last time, Steve.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
was just in the Pacey app away. So, but I caught your replay on YouTube and went through it a dozen times and made my own little spreadsheet based off all your formulas and everything. So
Good. Good. Yeah.
I got an interesting question on how to calculate or how to handle like carrier finance, um,
Sure. Yeah.
buyer's finance, and how does that work into the stabilization figures compared to,
Sure.
or even the purchase figures like this. So
Yeah, we can probably cover that in today's session. I'll be right back, Jake.
All right.
Should we get started, Jake?
Yeah, go ahead. You're good to go.
Okay. All right. So let's do this. Okay. First, I'd like to say, my name is Steve Velez. If we haven't met, glad to meet you virtually. I've been sub two for about 10 months, and I've been in multifamily before joining sub two, and really joined the community as a way to help grow my creative financing skills and apply it to multifamily. But in the meantime, I've learned a fair amount of private money lending skills and still growing there, as well as looking for opportunities in the single family space. So certainly sub two has helped me grow in many ways, but I would say that I'm more of my focus area is much more multifamily, and specifically I focus on asset management and underwriting, et cetera. So I'll do my best to answer any questions I can. I'll also say, bear with me today. I've been up since about 3:30 in the morning from a baby crying, and then we took a quick road trip today to Charlotte. So I've been driving all day and just got back about 45 minutes ago. So also my answers, bear with me. For those that were in last week's session or saw the replay, what I wanted to do is just bring this back up and just see if we can start with, were there any questions from last week's session? The one thing I do want to comment on was I started that session with the comment of like, I don't suggest people getting too caught up in the template, because every underwriting model or template is going to be a little bit different, but what's always the same or should be the same is what cash on cash mean, how do you get there, what NOI means, how do you get there, how do you incorporate multiple levels of debt. And so once you learn where those things are in the respective model you're using, it's parallel, right? And so a lot of times I get other people's models and I spend energy looking at what the formulas are doing, but I know the definition. So for me, it's just more about learning the model and what that person's underwriting model is meant to represent. But it starts with me actually understanding on what the underwriting, factors and methods are. So I would say, please, obviously you could use what you want here, but just be conscious that as a private money lender, what I think is important is you want to be able to understand at a high level what you think a deal looks like. And as a connector, you may not know all the intricacies of how to operate. And in multifamily, which is very different than single family, there is a very specific business plan you're going through. It's not just an acquisition and a dispo and an exit strategy. There's a whole business plan that goes into multifamily. So it's very difficult to know, at a very deep level when you're playing a connector role or a lending role. You want to understand if it's enough for you to connect on, if it's enough for you to lend on. And I think that's the intention here. So more than happy to go into details of models. This again, we started with essentially a blank sheet of paper and just tried to kind of work through the numbers. We're going to go into a more detailed model. I use a couple of models, all of which are proprietary, so I can't share the models, but I'll certainly walk through them and go through exactly what I'm looking for, what means what, so that you can find the model that fits you. A model is kind of like a personality thing. You got to fit you. And two, if you are connecting or you are lending or doing anything on a transaction that's not necessarily operating or being a GP, the people who are looking for the connection should have underwriting on this, right? And so you should be able to take anyone's underwriting model, look for the right things that tell you that this is a deal that you want to support, participate on, or lend on, right? So that's my goal here. Not teach you the model necessarily, but to teach you how to, understand what underwriting looks like. So that being said, were there any questions that came up about what we did in the first session, how we use the numbers, what they mean, how they impact each other at this level? Okay. So then what I'll do is I'll quickly skip to a more detailed model. And so what I did was very quickly, I took the exact same asset and I quickly incorporated it into a more detailed model. So that's what I'll be sharing right now. Okay. Everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. All right. So a lot of information here. What I'm going to go through again, if I kind of put a hat on that someone gave me this model and I'm trying to see if this is a deal that I want to connect on or I want to blend on or I want to participate in, how do I actually read it, right? So a few things to consider, right? Last session, we talked about getting the details. I showed you how to look at median income, which also tells you what county this is in. And so this is where I pull this off. I showed you how to look at the county population. And so as an example, I have, I typically look at something like this. Let me make this I still put something like this. If I look over the last, 5 years, what does my growth look like? And if you remember last week, we showed this drop off sort of after COVID and a lack of recovery in that particular market. So you see this very consistent, low growth, right? So we did all that last time. It's very much what I would eventually put into my detailed underwriting because the way I like to do it, and I recommend this to anyone, and we could talk about why you would have this, but I like to have a certain basis for which helps define what my buy box looks like. If I say I will not want to get into any deal, I will not want to connect on a deal, I will not want to lend on a deal that doesn't at least offer 8% cash on cash and a 20% IRR. Well, the way I do it is I would say this, and all of a sudden I know that this is a criteria point that it doesn't meet. That's how I detail my underwriting, but I do recommend that who you can connect with, or who you can lend with, or promote a borrower. You should know in some ways what you think makes a good enough deal for your perspective, the prospective people you're connecting to or lending to. So I say it's very important for you to understand like what makes a deal to you because you're finding what you think makes a deal for others, right? So I look at those things. Oh, but I went over there because things like population growth is something I look for. I look for relatively consistent 0.5% growth year over year, right? In this case, it doesn't hit that. I look at population, I look at salary, median income. Not everything has to be green, right? But I like to see certain things that make me feel good about the deal, right? And in this case, there's a fair amount of green here, right? So we talked about that. We talked about vintage last time. That's important to me. And we talked about what we think a purchase price might look like, right? The purchase price, purchase price or ask price was 13 million, if I remember. 13 million. I think where we ended up with this underwriting was 11.5. And so the first thing we want to do is kind of understand what does financing look like, right? And so here's a very brief view of how we want to characterize the attributes of financing. So if you look, there's different forms of financing, right? There's the first lien, typically called the acquisition financing, which could also be seller financing, depending on the structure. You might have mezzanine financing or supplemental financing, and then eventually you refi out, which the goal of a refi is typically to release all your liens or relieve all your liens or replace your liens, and then recover your investor capital on top of that, right? So if you remember last week, we spoke about how you have your debt service and then you have your investor capital, right? How much capital did you put into the deal? Because that helps rate your cash on cash. So it's important to know that you're telling your investors, in year 4, we're going to reinvest, and we're working towards getting you anywhere between 80 to 100% of your capital back. So there's 2 terms or phrases that I think are often used in multifamily, and I know sometimes vocabulary in multifamily gets maybe more complicated than it has to. So you don't have to remember these terms, but I think it's important to understand the intent. There's what is your return of capital and what is your return on capital? Okay, return of capital is essentially what's the time period or what's the return for which I'm going to get my investment back. Return on capital is essentially ROI, right? What's my return on that capital? So if we were to acquire an asset and we put $100,000 in it, and then we sold the asset and I got $100,000 back, I got all my capital return. My return on capital was 100%. But my return of capital was 0 because I didn't earn anything else on top of that. I just put my capital in and I got my capital back, right? And that's important to understand because in multifamily, typically there are certain cycles. So when you do a refinance, typically operators, except for those that are trying to do quick turnarounds, are looking to refi in 3 to 5 years, typically, especially when they're adding value. And the big benefit to doing that is just similar to single family, is to say, look, we want to return that capital as quickly as possible to our investors. So if they invested $100,000, if we could return all $100,000 to our investors in year 3, everything after that is a return on your capital and without me having any money in the deal. So in multifamily, most investors understand that when we say this is a long deal, right? This is a 3, 5, 7-year deal, and more often than not, 5 to 7, right? Sometimes 10, but more often than not, 5 to 7. The idea is 5 to 7 will help me understand what my return on capital is, but how quickly can I get my capital back? And the savvy investors in multifamily focus on that because it's all about your velocity on capital. The quicker you give me the 100K back in year 3, even if I'm getting returns after that, the quicker I'm putting that 100K into a second deal. Okay, and that's very important to understand because the return on capital, there's no gains on that, right? It's just your return back. And you're just basically, now you're in 2 assets for the same 100K. So that's really important to understand because it's not just about getting your cash out, it's about the mentality of recycling that back into the next deal, right? And then still getting returns on that, right? So that's where the distinction between return of capital and return on capital. But refi is meant to return your capital or get your return of capital, and then everything after that is your return on capital. So we have acquisition financing. I think here we assumed some standard financing, right? So we said maybe 60% down, a 25-year AM, about 6 3/4. This might be a little bit lower now. As your acquisition financing, that would mean that we're, borrowing about 6.9 at $11.5 million. No other debt. We look for that to be a 7-year hold. Typically, you can still get some interest-only payments, and that's really good when you're doing value add. And so if you're doing some value add or rehab work, the bank, lenders will often give you 12, 24, maybe 36 months of interest only because that's the time period of which you're doing a lot of value add. So the goal is that by the time your IO period ends, you've stabilized, if not mostly stabilized, completely stabilized, got your rents up, and you can actually afford the whole P&I payment, or you have another exit strategy in place. You're refining into a new loan, or you're selling, right? So it's really important to understand that interest only plays a role, specifically, not specifically, but probably more importantly, when you're doing some value add because you're expending CapEx and you want to keep your debt service lower for that time period. But just know you're not paying off your principal. We want to look at that. We got our purchase price here. We want to look at how long is our hold period. In this example, we said 7 years. It's important to know what we think the exit cap rate is going to be. We covered that last week. And that's because we want to understand what we think the valuation will be when we exit in 7 years. Okay, that's really important because that's going to influence your refi strategy or your exit or your sales strategy. And it's going to severely influence your investor metrics that you're telling people, like it's going to be, 22% IRR, and a certain equity multiple. So just please keep that in mind. What we didn't talk about last week, which is really important from a high level investment project summary, is, there are fees on top of typically a syndication, right? And JVs don't typically do things like this, or they structure it a bit differently. But in a syndication, you have these types of fees here, right? You have an acquisition fee, which is essentially fees that the sponsor team or GP team is charging for the work it put in to put this under contract, to acquire, to negotiate the acquisition terms, put the lender in place, get the legal contracts in place, organize the syndication, et cetera. It's all about getting the acquisition closed. And so typically that ranges anywhere from 1% to 3%. Typically I see 2 or 3%. I've seen up to 5, which to each their own, I think is rather high, but it all depends on the project, right? If it took a severe amount of work to get the acquisition under wraps and you're getting, or the investor's getting a solid return, it probably doesn't matter that much. I think it's worth kind of rewarding the GPs for the work that they did for getting a really difficult deal on the contract and still giving you a return. An asset management fee, acquisition fee is typically based off of the price. Asset management fee is essentially the fee that GPs will charge to manage the property on a day-to-day basis. Essentially, the GP team's responsible for executing the business plan. That business plan, it takes work to do, right? So this is essentially rewarding or paying the GP team to asset manage this property and execute the business plan. Again, I see these range between 2 and 4%, some higher, some lower. I've seen people take like a 2% acquisition fee and maybe no asset management fee. It just depends on the structure itself because they're offering the investors sort of a different profile. There's also a disposition fee. Disposition fee is on the sale price, the fee that the GP will make to on sale. Okay, and so why is this important? Because in this example, we're paying the GP team $345,000 over the 7-year period because of rewarding them for actually getting this under contract, getting this amazing asset on the contract, right? If you think this is a great deal. We're paying them 2% on equity, in this case, $950,000 over the life cycle of the project, 2% a year to manage the property according to the plan and get you your 8%, 10% return or whatever it is that's in the pro forma. And then we're rewarding the GP team for making sure they execute that sale at a reasonable price and not just selling, at a price that's below the business plan, but they got their fees and the LPs don't get all their deals. So the intention is to reward them to stay to the business plan, right? So it's really important that you take a look at this. If you think that the business plan is, like the example I mentioned where I've seen a really low asset management fee, the property was brand new. They were doing no value add, no additions to it. I mean, it was just developed, and they're doing in-house property management. So they expected very little asset management work. And I think that's fair, right? But I've seen others that are in a similar boat charging 3-4% for the fee and not for the work. So I think this is important because these kinds of things can make or break a deal. But frankly speaking, if you can charge 5% fees across the board and you're still able to deliver 10% return or 8% or 9%, whatever it is that you're looking for, it's really up to you whether or not you just care about making sure the investors get the returns, or maybe you just don't like working with that type of operator, right? So just keep that in mind. All right. So I mentioned a lot of things. Specifically, I mentioned a lot of things we talked about last week to refresh it, but I did mention a couple of new things, and I want to take a pause here to just get a sense of how those new factors influence how we would look at underwriting. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Again, why this is important is if a operator sends you an underwriting and they don't have any fees, they just have a purchase price and a rehab price, I would ask a question like, hey, are you charging any acquisition fees, asset management fees, because they come off of your cash flow? So if someone's promising you 7, 8, 10%, and they're not calculating fees and they go, oh yeah, that's going to influence your cash flow, right? So just keep that in mind. These are good questions to ask when you're connecting a deal. I'll give you an example. If right now this is returning 6%, which is, I'll say mediocre. Not many people would do that. If I was to take this out and this out, and this out, I'm making 8.5%. Now this looks like a pretty good deal. Okay, so if you see something like this and it's like, 8.5%, like that's pretty good. I'll take it, right? 2.7 multiple over 7 years, I'll take it. You ask them about fees and you find that they're charging really high fees and all of a sudden it drops down to under 6. It's not a good deal anymore, right? Or not as good of a deal anymore. So that's why I say it's really important for you to know to ask those questions because these things will be documented in the agreements. You need to make sure it's part of the underwriting itself, right? There was a question in the beginning from James about seller financing. So if I go back to while I'm here. I think last time we said there was a loan assumption, if I remember correctly. 4.96. So let's just pretend here for a second that we assume this loan. Forgot how much time it had. I think if I remember, it was about 4 years left. It was about 4 years left. And then we decide, financing, we want to create like a seller carryback. Okay. We could say, hey, loan to value. We could say, hey, we want to carry back, 20% of this. So the seller will finance 2.3 million, will assume their loan of 6.9 million. What is that? So that's 9.4. We'll bring the rest of it to the table. We'll bring the 2.1 through a capital raise to the table. Right. So if we were to do this, we would then do similar things. We'd say, okay, well, this is an addition. We think that here's the first position. Here's the second position. They're going to lend 2.3 million for the same 4 years because you do have to make sure you don't go any longer than this acquisition financing. So in this case, I would line it to 4 years. There's no, let's say, no interest only, and they're going to charge you a 5% interest rate.
Hey, let me
Okay, so
interrupt real quick. Sorry. Trevor
No.
asked, what is mezz financing and LTC mean?
Good question. Mezz financing is essentially like financing to support the primary acquisition. So it could be bridge lending, supplemental lending, but the idea is essentially like a secondary debt you're putting on top of it to support the project. Right. So that might be a different term than, for example, in this case, let's say we wanted to do bridge debt to do the rehab, right? We might keep the current debt in place. We might go find another lender to help us borrow the rehab budget, and they would be in second position, and they would have different terms, completely different terms, right? Typically, bridge debt is, 10, 12, 15%, depending on the lender. That's your question, Trevor? Yeah. Okay. The second question was LTC. So LTV is loan to value, LTC is loan to cost. So the difference being that loan to value is essentially what's the percentage based off of the appraised value of the property. So in this case, if this appraised at 11.5 or sold at 11.5, 60% of your purchase price is what you're borrowing. When you're doing loan to LTC, loan to cost, you're basically including the cost of rehab on top of that. So you're saying, hey, if it's going to take us 11.5 million to rehab and another 1.2 million dollars to do the renovations, I want to do 20% of loan to cost. So like as an example here, if I were to change this to loan to cost, you see this amount goes up because now it's saying this lender or the seller in this case is going to cover 20% part of the debt as well as the rehab costs. So you're not coming out of pocket or finding another borrower to do the construction or rehab costs. Pretty rare, and frequent that the seller will do an LTC loan, but banks would. Depending on the size, banks might give you like 80, 90% of the loan to value and then 100% of construction or 90% of construction. So they can give you most of the funds, but not all. Yeah. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just change this term for 4 years. So if you look at this example, we now have we shifted from a sort of conventional debt, 6.75, which maybe is a little bit high right now, 25 AM, and a seller carryback on it, and we went from 6.75 to 4.9, and then we added supplemental debt on it or seller financing debt on it. If you go back and look at what does that look like, Let's go to cash flow here for a second. Yeah, so if we look here, we're looking now at year one would give us 3.9%. Year two would give us 7.8. Year three would give us 11. And if we actually are able to sell and refi the third year, in the fourth year, sorry, we'd be able to pay off all our debts and still cash out about double the value, right? Which is a good deal, which is a very good deal, right? So with the sale, what we're saying is your IRR jumps up to 25%. That's amazing. Your multiple got a little smaller because we shortened the term to 7 years, and your cash on cash is doing really well because we were able to sell at 9.5 million, right? And still come out 200% ahead. So we've doubled our money on the sale in this particular example, right? So, sorry, final sale was 34 million. So we bought it at 11.5. In 4 years, we've added value. We've appreciated. We sold at 18 million. We paid our fees like we talked about in the beginning. We paid off first position, we paid off second position, and we still left with $9 million. Right? And remember, in this case, we brought to the table the renovation costs, the closing costs, et cetera. And so we were able to get out of it. Sorry, we had to put in 4.5 million. We put in 4.5 million. We cash out at 9.5 million. That's why there's a double the return there. We get all our money back, all our money out, and another $4.6 million. If that makes any sense. Now, if we decided that that wasn't the case and this whole thing was going to be seller financed, we could say, okay, well, the seller's willing to seller finance 70%, whatever your terms are, whatever their rates are, maybe it's 6%. And so we would essentially just characterize this as seller finance in first position, and we don't need any other debt service or lien position on it. So it just depends on the type of structure that the current lending terms are on. Any questions on just the debt? It's important to know in multifamily a couple things. Not all loans are assumable. In a fair amount of cases, it's really hard to do subject to with a commercial loan, and it always depends on the structure of the loan and the lender that's involved, because most commercial banks will essentially securitize the loan in a manner that might prevent you from doing subject to. I mean, it becomes more stricter to move the deed without the mortgage. Loan assumptions in multifamily are pretty common. You are taking the debt, but that's typically more legal. Not all banks will allow loan assumptions. Okay, so be careful when someone says, "Oh, we're planning on taking over their loan at whatever it was 60%, and we're going to carry back the rest." And we're like, "Well, do you have the loan documentation that states that this could be assumed?" Right? That's number one. Number two is, do they even have confirmation that even though it could be assumed, they're willing to take on a second position? Not all lenders will allow a second position. Right? So that means your whole idea of trying to supplement this, it's out the window, right? Either you get new financing or you take over existing financing. Difference being that if you take new financing, you might be able to get 70-75% LTV, maybe even LTC. Or if you take on existing financing, which I think was closer to 60%, you're now raising more capital. So that's where, like I said, a business plan is going to be really important, because you want to make sure you understand what the financing strategy is, acquisition strategy is. Any questions or comments on that? So the next thing I want to do is kind of go through the details of the underwriting. So here, if you notice, this particular plan had 1 bedrooms and 2 and 1.5 bedrooms is split pretty evenly. This is their square footage. Oftentimes when you do comps, you can look at like, what's the square footage, dollar per square footage? Are they townhomes? Are they apartments? They have different ways to look at comps. The thing that I will tell you that's also a little different from those that are coming with single family, although it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, is when you comp rents, you want to be clear that amenities could be very different, right? So some of the easier things are you can't compare your 128 unit that has no major amenities with one that has a pool, a dog park, a gym, a billiards room, and other facilities and activities, right? So you have to actually not just look at age and square footage, but look at amenities, look at age. You can't compare a 128 unit to a 350 unit, right? So you do want to make sure that when you look at comps, you look at, don't compare a 1,000 2 and 1.5 bedroom apartment in this 128 unit to a house, or don't compare it to a 2023 build, right, with tons of amenities. So you do have to be conscious of that. But what's important here is you want to kind of put in here what you think market rents is for year 1. And then we're going to talk about why that's important. So get this right. And when I say right, I mean right in your head. So this can be conservative, this can be aggressive, but just be consistent. Okay. So if you're going to be conservative with your estimate, just know that everything else should be conservative. Don't be conservative on the rents and then think that you're going to have an 8% increase of rent year over year over year. You're being conservative on the comps and aggressive on the increases, right? So just be conscious of making sure that you're consistent. If you're going to be aggressive, then your business plan has to be aggressive. It's probably going to be hard to sell, not impossible, but just hard to sell, right? And so that's where you want to be keen on when you're connecting to people. Anyone can make a deal look good by making very subtle adjustments to rental comps, to your cap rate. Super easy, right? They just need to make sense. So really, certainly make sure you comp apples to apples. In this example, if you look, here there's about $250 rent increase, about a $300 rent increase. It's pretty aggressive, right? And so you're swinging the gross income from 1.6 to 2.07. It's $350,000. That may not sound like a lot, but when you're evaluating this against the cap rate, 25% increase in income against a good cap rate is why in this model right now, the way it's drafted, it's selling for $18 million, right? Because it's compounding what the valuation is going to look like. You want to understand what other income looks like. So there's application fees, there's pet fees, there's laundry income, there's what they call RUBS, which is ratio utility billing system, which is meant to charge back against utilities that are taken on if units are not individually metered. And it has to go through a very specific service. And there's like other income you might have, like other fees, trash fees, other supplemental fees that you may be included, like rental fees, services, et cetera. So you really want to understand, again, what these comps look like in the market, because some operators don't have much other income, and they're really not capturing their full capacity because they're not even charging application fees or pet fees. And so there's an opportunity, if that market warrants it, there's an opportunity to start adding some fees to support what a market might typically do. Again, not all markets charge pet fees or even allow pets. So you want to make sure that you're aligned to what that market is going to allow you to do. So this part is important to understand where you think the income is going, what you think comps are going to be from current to year 1, and what you think what your year 1 income will look like. All right. In this case, we didn't have all this from the underwriting, so that's why this is blank to kind of compare apples to apples. But if I remember, we had high level stuff. So their other income was $217,000. Mine was 201, right? Without looking at their underwriting at all, right? Without looking at theirs, I'm off by 16,000, right? And that's because I make certain assumptions that basically, if we assume that there's going to be a few tenants a year that are leaving, they're paying $55 an application. We assume that a certain percentage of the tenants will pay a pet fee. You know, we make certain assumptions about what we think the expenses might look like, but all income is made up of gross rental and other income. That's what makes up your what they call EGI, which is your estimated gross income. That's your total income. It's part of the NOI, that's your total income. Okay. Any questions on income before I move to CapEx? Okay, CapEx, super important, right? So if you remember when last week, when we did underwriting, we made like very broad assumptions, right? Like CapEx is, OpEx is going to cost me 50%, 45%, right? I can't remember what number we used, but typically a back of the napkin might use like a 45%, 50%, somewhere around that 40 to 55% as a random, here's what I think operating expenses will look like in that market. But once you get to detailed underwriting, you want to really understand like what does a property manager look like, right? Is it reasonable? If it's a really large, typically above 50 units, you have on-site payroll. You know, a dedicated maintenance person, right? The bigger it is, 120 units, you might have on-site property management, right? And on-site facilities. If your management fee, you want to look up the taxes. Never trust taxes that are in any document provided to you, right? So you want to go to your local county tax assessor or local to the property. So remember, we found out the county, we just go Google the county name, maybe the state tax assessor office, right? Or tax assessor, tax records. And you'll find the community tax records office. And you typically, in a lot of counties, you can just look up the tax bill for, let's say, 2023 or 2024 for this particular asset. So that's going to be really important. So you know what they actually paid for. It's important to know what they call as a mill rate. So every county has a city percentage, a county percentage. They have percentage that goes to the police and fire department. They have all these things that basically say we will take some valuation of the property and multiply it by this percentage mill rate. If you know the mill rate in your county, you can almost calculate to some extent what you think it might be when there's a new assessment, right? Some counties will charge taxes based on the last sale price. Some counties will do assessments every 4 years, every 6 years. So knowing what the county does for tax assessments is going to be really important, because there's typically 3 things that are the most critical things on an OpEx perspective that can really hurt your NOI, right? Or impact your NOI, I should say. Taxes, right? Because taxes can triple, right? Depends on where you're located. I'm sure you've heard some locations where taxes have done that on single family. It's worse in multifamily because the valuations are much bigger. Insurance, right? Same thing. You've heard certain locations in the country where insurance has gone off the roof. And then just like regular operating expenditures that a tree falls and hits the building, a car drives through the building, pipes burst, foundation has problems, things that you couldn't predict. Those are the 3 big factors. So if you can make sure that you calculated and understood your tax rate, you know what you're getting into. Insurance and OpEx are typically harder to predict unless you have a really good insurance carrier. There are a lot of business plans out there that do things like they get into the opportunity zone. And if the opportunity zone gives them a certain tax abatement where they can lock in their taxes, they're living it good because they've now locked in one of the factors, which is taxes, and they just have to worry about insurance, right? At least for a particular period. Insurance, like I said, you should have an insurance quote from someone. Repairs and maintenance kind of depends on your market. I typically go by somewhere around 600 a unit. Again, it depends on the market that you're looking at. Contractors, whether it's landscaping, facilities, trash removal, all those things. General admin to manage your property, marketing to get tenants in, I mentioned payroll, and utilities, right? Utilities I like to use based off what the current utilities are. On the OpEx side, again, part of the expense of the building would be to pay for asset management. So that's important to know. But if you look here, there's typically always a a reserve, a capital reserve, we want to claw back on an annual basis. So typically people do somewhere between 200 or 300 per unit, maybe 250 per unit, where they're saying that every month they're going to hold back $3,200 before cash flow distribution to put towards the reserves in case things go wrong. When the reserves reaches a certain amount, they may stop doing that and they just give more cash flow back. But the whole idea is nobody wants to have a problem where the plumbing is having an issue, and then we have to ask investors to bring in more capital, right? We never want to do that. So if we can kind of build a reserve for that, then we have a situation where we can maintain the shop, give back if we think we have excess reserves, but better to give back than it is to have to request more funds. This is a view of OpEx, much more detailed view than assumptions we made. Numbers should matter, right? So now we're looking at the T12 said it was about a $790,000 OpEx. I have about an $866 OpEx. It's higher, but I'm also protecting more income, right? So my OpEx ratio is 38%. Theirs was 47% based on lower income, right? This matters if you got a kick-ass team or a great property management team that works that market, you know them very well. This is their bread and butter. This is why operators vertically integrate, because no one will care about the property more than people who are owning the property. And they are sitting there really trying to make sure they can get the OpEx down to a fine rhythm, right? Third party, nothing wrong with it, but they're typically going to focus on just getting this percentage and you have to stay on top of them. So you may see a big variance between OpEx based on how your team is operating. Okay, these numbers here, this number and this number, which is the OpEx plus the things that happened post the OpEx expenses, is what makes your total OpEx line. Okay, we just covered estimated gross income. Now we just covered total operating expense. Okay, that's what makes our NOI, right? When we take our total operating expense away from estimated gross income, we have NOI. All right, any questions or comments on OpEx? Okay. On acquisition budget, what's also important is to understand, PACE often talks about like entry fees and things like that and really understanding what they look like, or entry costs. So here's same thing, right? We have a down payment, do we have a sense of what closing costs look like? Do we actually have that from historical experience or from a lender, what closing costs might look like? A lot of lenders require that the sponsors have working capital ahead of time. So not the 250 I mentioned earlier, or 200, but they have working capital going into the project. They may need to have 6 to 12 months of insurance, 6 to 12 months of taxes. Okay, so lenders want to be careful that if anything happens to go wrong, not only can you cover your debt and your DSCR, but you can also cover any types of unexpected issues, because banks don't want you to default, right, on an asset like this. So they want you to not only come in with a down payment, not only come in with closing costs, but sufficient reserves that they feel are adequate enough for an asset of this size. And then there's your acquisition cost here, right? So I think here we estimated about 10,000 per unit, right? Some already renovated, some weren't, but those that weren't, I think we thought it was going to be a much larger renovation. Those that were maybe minor, so we kind of averaged it out. But the total acquisition cost was going to be your closing cost, your reserves, and your rehab. So we would be raising this amount of money. Now, if you're wholesaling, right, then you need a wholesaling fee up here. Yeah, you have to include some kind of wholesaling fee in here, or you're receiving this from wholesalers. So again, as a connector in underwriting, you need to understand how did they come up with their estimated gross income? How did they come up with the operating expense? Does it seem like it's appropriate, right? They're not just making it look like we could run this at a 20% OpEx, right? And are they actually accounting for all the operating expenses, including things like reserves that banks may have required on them, right? So asking a borrower or asking someone looking for money, hey, have you included working reserves, right? Or your lender asking for working reserves, and they say, yeah. Well, I don't see that in the total capital raise. It influences your cash on cash. Remember, the more money you bring into the investment, right? If the cash flow stays the same, the lower your cash on cash will be lower because your return on the higher amount is going to have lower returns, right? So it's really important when you're trying to connect someone to something that, that transparency is clear to the lenders or LPs or whomever you're really getting involved with. Any questions on the acquisition side? This is essentially like what we need at closing. Okay. The last thing that I do want to cover is I'm trying to make this as simple as possible, but there's a very important factor called occupancy. People talk about occupancy or vacancy. And so there's two things I think as a connector or a lender you really need to know, and people don't often talk with a lot of clarity on it, right? Which is the difference between physical occupancy and economic occupancy, right? And so the difference is physical occupancy means I have a vacancy in the unit. There's no one living there at the moment. Okay. And some owners or some brokers may count vacancy, but someone is leased up and they're going to move in 2 months. Depending on that number, you may care more. If it's a few, you may not. But if it's a significant amount, it's a vacancy. It's a physical vacancy, and a bank may or may not care about that depending on your relationship with the bank. So, like in this case, I go back. I don't remember what this was. We had a 96% occupancy. And so I don't know, what is that, like one or two or a handful that were missing? Let me see. Yeah, 5 units of the 128 were not occupied. Okay, but I did put it. I don't have the rent roll with me, but what's even more important is economic occupancy. So let's imagine that, and I'll go here because this is what triggers it. Let's imagine that 5 units are vacant, but 10 units are behind payments, meaning they're a month or 2 behind their payments. So they're a bit delinquent. So this is why getting a rent roll is really important, because you can validate the current rents, but you can also validate who's paying. Anybody can say my gross income should be X, but if no one's paying, you're not earning income, right? And so as soon as we do that, well, we have only 5 physically vacant apartments or units, but we have 10 economic. Well, now we're down to 88% economic occupancy. Do you think the bank cares that you have 96% physical occupancy, or do you think they care they have 88% economic occupancy? This affects NOI directly. This does, but it's missing the fact that people aren't paying. So this is really, really, really important to understand, right? Especially when you see people who have, they're doing a rehab on the whole building. Maybe their physical occupancy is actually 60%. Banks typically want 90% occupancy and above. So now you're talking hard money lender. Now you're talking about private equity. Now you're talking about different ways of sourcing debt. But this right here changes from a bank definitely being okay. The bank started to question like whether or not we need to change terms on you because you're sliding below 90. This might lead to evictions, right? In order to get to 96%. So that's really important.
Steve, Trevor asked, what would be a fair connector fee percentage for this scenario?
A fair connector fee, it depends on what the connection's for. So typically, if you're looking for, I mean, I don't think that's a static answer for one, right? I think it's really based on like what you're bringing to the table. But if you're connecting someone who found the deal to someone who wants to acquire the deal, I think that's a negotiation between who you're working with. Like, does the wholesaler want to split their fee with you? Or does the person buying want to split their acquisition fee with you? Or maybe not split, but like give you a piece of it. But it's really difficult because in multifamily, it's very difficult to say, oh, well, we'll charge like a 1%, connector fee, right? Or even a finder fee when 1% of a $13 million acquisition is, no operator is going to want to pay, I think, a 1% acquisition fee, right? Because it's going to completely eat into all the work it takes for them to take that to the finish line and actually get acquisition to wrap. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I think it just depends on your relationship with who you're sourcing with. It's probably going to be a flat fee. right? And what their pain point is. But I could see for a deal like this, it being a 5-figure, if not 6-figure, potential fee. Again, depends on if you lined up a buyer and closed the deal with them, then I could see that being a valuable play. All right, in the last few minutes, I do want to talk about why that was important. I don't want people to get cross-eyed on this one. I think this is essentially a way of taking all that information we put on those other sheets, the lending terms, the income, the operating expenses, the fees, all of that onto a very projected plan over the next X number of years, depending on the hold, and starting to project year over year over year. And why is that important? Okay, and without going into every line here, right? The one thing I want to make sure people understand is that when someone says that they can get rents, what did I say here? Let's use this example. Let's say that this is 1,000 at rent, but when I fully stabilize it, and Alex, we didn't cover this in our conversation, but when I fully stabilize it, I can get it to 1,250. Okay, that's great, right? Is that in year 1? Or is that in year 3? It's really important that when people ask and they say, oh, rents are 1,000, we can rehab this and get this up to 1,250. Amazing. But if they're not telling you, well, when is that? Is that year 1, year 2, year 3? You're telling a completely different story, right? You're telling a story of, I'm going to start hitting 1,250 year 1 versus 1,175 in year 1, 1,215 in year 2, and then eventually 1,250 in year 3, right? That is a complete different set of returns. So why I want to bring that up is because people don't often characterize it that way. And if they're, again, good underwriters and you've worked with them before, they would have. But if they don't and they're still kind of figuring out how to underwrite, they're going to miss that. And people often assume that's the case. So in this case, if you notice, that's what loss to lease means. So even though I put 1,250, and I don't think that's possible in year 1, I'm basically saying that even though I have, oh, let me fix that. Even though I have 96% occupancy, I think that I won't hit any more than 1.8 million in rents. My average rent is only 1040. I only went up a little bit. Why? Because it's going to take me 3 months or so to transition the property. It's going to take me some time to start stabilizing the property and renovate 20, 30 units in the last 6 months, right? So I'm going to inch towards it. But if you notice, I'm not hitting 1,250 or so until year 3, which makes sense, right? But when people say I can raise it to 1,250, it's a big difference when you say year 1 versus year 3. And so that's what loss to lease shows. Loss to lease will show what is my market rent against what am I actually getting today? So what is the gap between 1,250 and what I'm getting right now? And this is saying that I'm 18%, 17% below market rent. Okay. Now remember, we're still taking into account all these rent increases. By year 4, I'm starting to get to 1361. Now I'm starting to see full stabilization, 3% rent bumps, or maybe the market is 2% or 4%, whatever you think it is. Now I'm starting to operate and get my income into a good place. This is where I think there's a lot of traps. People do not account for the fact that it takes years to stabilize 128 units. Or someone saying, I'm buying 128 unit, only 30 units need rehab. We think we could pump that out in 18 months. Very different than if I had to rehab 128 units, because I'm not going to be making that cash up front, right? OpEx can be relatively static, but that's going to change your NOI. Let me just show you as an example. If you believe that that they're going to hit 1292 or 1250 in that first year, and you don't ask those questions, my return went up to 8.7% in year 1. From 3. Okay, so it's a very ugly assumption to believe that I'm just going to snap my fingers, and in the entire year one, I'm going to be at a 0% loss to lease. So there's typically always some loss to lease, 3 to 2%. You should never have zero. But again, I'll keep in mind, I'll mention, you have a amazing rehab team. You could knock out 120 units in 1 year. Maybe they're in-house, you could do it. The reality is you will still not be able to demand those rents in day one. You will not get 12 full months of the rent. You will not be able to renew all those leases on day one, right? Leases have to go through their attrition. So just be conscious that that year one stabilization is always going to take a little bit of time. So if I remember correctly, this NOI was not that far off. So their NOI was 901 right now, right? So this assumption here is saying, as I'm starting to rehab, as I'm maybe starting to turn some units, I can maybe hit 933. It's kind of conservative. It's a fair amount, but once I start kicking in and getting into only 9%, loss to lease, I'm now starting getting to 1.1 million, 1.2 million. It's important to understand the progression. You can't assume you're going to make 1.25 million in year one. So now you have to question, what is the business plan? What does their stabilization period look like? Do they have an experienced team? Do they know the market can warrant a 3% increase? Maybe it's only 2% increase, right? So that's why not looking at the details, it's important to understand loss to lease and what their business plan is really, what is their business plan for how long it's going to take to do stabilization. This is why people don't typically flip multifamily, right? It takes them time to stabilize, it takes them time to get their NOI, and it takes them time to get the valuation. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I think you're just a great presenter, man. No questions at all. I love it.
Either that or I put everyone to sleep.
No.
So my advice, what I try to do is call out key questions that you want to ask. Like, again, my intention here is not like go out and find a deal and underwrite it. If that helped you, great. But like, what are the right questions to ask, right? What's the occupancy? What's the business plan towards stabilization? What are your loan assumptions? What are your lender requirements? What's your OPEX ratio like? And give you underwriting. Like, in my opinion, I'm an operator, right? Anybody that asks me that I'm asking to give the money, if they want to look at underwriting, there should be no reason why I can't offer it. Right. And so I would say that if you're connecting or supporting a deal and they give you underwriting, yeah, it doesn't look anything like this, but you'll know what loss to lease means. You'll know what physical occupancy means. You'll ask the questions, hey, I see your rent roll looks like you have 3 vacancies. Do you have delinquency report? Because you may have a lot of non-paying tenants, right? So my goal was to help you ask more of the right questions to help you understand whether or not you want to participate in the deal. I hope that's helpful. No
Love
other
it,
questions?
Steve.
Yeah.
Love it.
Great. Okay, Jake. Want to wrap up here?
Yeah, we'll wrap it up here.
Sure. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I mentioned on the last call, you can certainly reach out to me on Facebook. I have my barcode here. You can reach out to me there as well. More than happy to help answer questions that you have or even go through a very specific underwriting session with you if that's something that you think you're interested in. But definitely reach out to me if you need anything. I'm here to help.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. I'll see everybody next week and we'll pick it up from there.
All right, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks,
All right.
Steve.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks, everyone.